Greetings in the Messiah. The class that we're going to be looking at in this study is the messianic and eschatological significance of the afikomen and the third and fourth cup of juice or cup of wine. I find this a very fascinating subject, and I think, I hope anyway, you will agree with me when we are through with these lessons of this class. Oftentimes we don't understand or recognize the underlying Jewish culture. Communion itself is a well-established ordinance in Bible-believing churches. Now, regardless of whether the practice is done weekly or monthly or quarterly or whatever set time, it's become so common that many miss and rarely consider the underlying impact of what Jesus was teaching at his last Passover. Now, a primary reason is that oftentimes in a church culture, our view of Scripture is driven more by tradition. The Jewish cultural background of communion and many other traditions we hold is seldom, if ever, considered. So in these 4 lessons that we will be looking at, we're going to look at the Jewish background of what Jesus was communicating with the bread and with the third and fourth cup of juice. And we'll explain why a third and fourth cup as we continue in these lessons. Communion was instituted at the final Passover Seder that Jesus observed. Some 40 years later, the practice of the Passover in the Jewish world would undergo major changes. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and obviously with the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple as well, had a major impact on the format of the Passover and the afikomen. That's the bread. The birth of Christianity and the surrounding culture, now that the Jewish people were in diaspora, dispersion, this is after 70 AD, also played a major role in the way Passover evolved. Today, on today's Seder table, the celebration of Passover, Jewish people have a tradition of a matzo bag with 3 compartments and a board of matzah in each compartment. Now, this tradition is centuries old. And what happens with this matzo bag and these 3 boards of matzah is that early in the evening, the middle board of matzah is removed from this bag. It's broken in half, and the larger piece is wrapped in a linen napkin and is called afikomen. And this becomes one of the focal points of the Seder, not only today, but for the last 2 millennia, even at the time of Jesus, as we shall see. Prior to the destruction of the temple, the lamb was brought to the temple to be sacrificed, and the edible parts brought to the home for the Seder that evening. And by the way, let me just explain Passover Seder. Seder means order, and the order of the Passover has remained the same for millennia. The order of the Passover at the time of Jesus is the same order of the Passover that you will find in Jewish homes today. The difference being the elements on the table. They changed after 70 AD. But Seder means order, the order of the Passover. Jesus followed the customs of his day in the celebration of the Passover that we would expect and that we know from reading the account in the Gospels of Jesus' celebration with his followers of the Passover. So we are going to look at the Passover Seder that Jesus participated in from the account found in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 26. Now in verses 19 and 20, we are told that this was clearly a Passover celebration. These verses read, "And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. Now when the evening was come, he sat down with the 12. Well, the Passover preparation was to bring the lamb to the temple. It would be offered there. The edible parts would be brought back to the house, and that evening they would gather together and celebrate the remembrance of the Exodus of Egypt around a bunch of traditions, but one, the eating of that Passover lamb. And so when the evening was come, Jesus sat down with his apostles to remember the Exodus from Egypt. This was clearly a Passover Seder. Matzah was an integral part of the Passover, actually going back to the first Passover, recorded in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 8. We are told this, "And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it." So in the original Passover in Egypt, unleavened bread, matzah, was present. And it was present there at the table with Jesus, and it is present today on the table of Jewish families around the world as they celebrate the Passover. And so in verse 26, we read this of Matthew 26. "And as they were eating, Jesus took bread." Now, I believe that would have been the afikomen. Now, we'll consider that in the next lesson in detail. But Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." So clearly, matzah, the bread, was on the table at the time of Jesus, just as it was at the first Passover, just as it is today. The cups of juice were not present at the first Passover recorded in Exodus 12. Now, we are going to consider the cups of juice, and there are 4 cups of juice that are partaken of in today's Passover. This tradition predates the time of Jesus, and we will consider that in the lessons ahead. But what I want us to see right now is that at the first Passover, Exodus chapter 12, no juice was present. Again, in verse 8, we are told this, "And they shall eat the flesh," that's the lamb, "in that night, roast with fire, and unleavened bread," that's matzah, "and with bitter herbs," that's maror, that's the bitter herbs you will find even today on the table. That certainly was on the table at the time of Jesus as well. "They shall eat it." In Exodus chapter 12, there are only 3 items present: the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. Today you have juice, wine, 4 cups. And again, it predates the time of Jesus, because we do know that at that last Passover Seder Jesus celebrated, there were juice present. The cups were present. Because we are told in verse 27 and 28, this would be the 3rd cup. We'll consider this in detail later. "He," Jesus, "took the cup and gave thanks, gave it to them, saying, 'Drink ye all of it. For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. So clearly, at the Passover Seder that Jesus celebrated, there were the cups of wine or juice. This, I believe, would have been the third cup of wine. But as we go to the next verse, Jesus then says to those who are celebrating the Passover with him, "But I will say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. I will drink the third cup, but I will no longer drink any cups this evening. One cup remains, the fourth cup, until I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Now, we will again consider this in more detail in some of the lessons that lie ahead. But two of the primary items on the Passover table today is the bread, the afikomen, and the cups of juice. And the two primary items that Jesus referenced and used at his day was the bread, and I believe it was the afikomen bread, and the juice, the cups, that he illustrated some amazing truths through those. So the next lesson, we're going to look at the afikomen bread, the matzah. We're going to look at its history, its meaning, and what we learn from this and the bread, the matzah, the afikomen, at Jesus' Passover. It's a fascinating insight how providentially God used the occurrence of something to give us some amazing truths through the bread, the afikomen, and the cups of juice. Until next time, shalom.